Welcome back. So let's talk about some protozoans. All right, protozoa. These are single-celled eukaryotes. And a whole bunch of them are medically important, and we're not going to be able to do the protozoans justice in this class, unfortunately, but we'll hit some highlights on a few of them. What are some key characteristics of protozoans? So these are single-celled eukaryotes, so one cell is one individual, and the cells are structurally similar to animal cells. So you might think of an alga, that's the singular for algae, as single-celled plants, and protozoans are more like single-celled animals, just in terms of how the cells are composed and how they function. All right, so most are motile. So we've already talked about bacterial motility. And protozoans, most are motile, not all of them. And the ones that are capable of moving, they have three different possibilities. So one is pseudopods is what allows them to move, or pseudopodia allows them to move around. And pseudopod, pseudo-false, pod, like a podiatrist is a foot doctor. It means false foot. And so on this diagram picture over here, this is an amoeba, a type of protozoan. You may have seen amoebas under the microscope before. And if you ever have, you know they send out these projections and then they drag the rest of the cell behind them. And so those little projections that they send out are called pseudopods. So they kind of ooze around. And you have cells in your body that do that too. If you've studied macrophages before, that's what they do. They send out pseudopods and drag the rest of the cell behind them, and that's how they kind of ooze around and move around in your tissues looking for things that they need to engulf and digest and break down. All right, and some protozoans have cilia. So hopefully you can see on the picture, there are little hair-like projections. They whip back and forth like this and help the protozoan move around. And then some have flagella, and some will have more than one flagellum. This is a picture of a type of protozoan called a trypanosome. So the little light pink cells are red blood cells, and the things that kind of look like purple seahorses are those are called trypanosomes. And the thinner area right in there and over here, each of those is a flagellum. That's a single one-tail-like feature, and those whip back and forth. Remember, bacterial flagella rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. Eukaryotic flagella whip back and forth. So these are like the flagella that you would have on a human sperm cell that whip and allow them to swim. Maybe you've seen videos of that before. All right, protozoans, most of them live freely in water. However, some are parasites. So if we remember what separates a parasite from another type of living thing, parasites must have a host, so they live on or inside another living thing. And then on top of that, they harm the host. So they're not there as a friendly cohabitator. They're actually harming the host. That makes something a parasite. So some protozoans are harmful parasites. Most produce asexually, so one cell divides into two. I want to point out, all right, so I'm not going to play this. I'm not going to do a video in a video, but this is a link to a Monsters Inside Me video about leishmaniasis, and I would like you to please view that video. So you can click the link in the PowerPoint, and it'll bring that up, or you can just run a search for it. If you Google Monsters Inside Me leishmaniasis, it should bring up that video clip for you. And that's one I want you guys to be familiar with. It's a type of protozoan, and it has typically been way more common in the Middle East and also in Central America, all the way up into Mexico. However, there's a type of fly that bites people and delivers this leishmania parasite, injects it into the skin, and causes a terrible infection if it's not treated. And it could be an emerging problem in the United States because these sandflies that deliver that protozoan and bite people and inject them with this protozoan are migrating into the United States from Mexico. So it's something you guys may see during your medical career. Also, some of our medical personnel from the Middle East have gotten infections with leishmania. So it's one of these emerging types of infections, something we don't hear a lot about now, but we may be hearing about it in the future. All right, with protozoans, Many have two different life stages, and one is called the trophozoite stage. And when you see TROPH in biology, that usually refers to feeding. So this is a feeding stage. It's motile generally, actively multiplying, reproducing. So it needs moisture and nutrients to stay in that stage. And then there's a cyst stage. So many protozoans form cysts, and they're not really like an egg, but they're kind of like the endospores of bacteria that we were talking about. They're a dormant stage where there's a hard protective shell, and the components of the cell on the inside are inactive. Resistant to things like heat and drying and chemicals, so these cysts can persist sometimes like out in soil and so forth for very long periods of time. And then when a host comes along and picks up these cysts, the cysts can convert back into a trophozoite stage. So a lot of protozoans go from a trophozoite to a cyst and back to a trophozoite stage when they find a new host. Because these cysts are really difficult to control, they're an important factor in the spread of disease. It makes it much more likely that people are going to pick up these protozoans being passed around from one host to another. All right, so this is just a diagram from your textbook, which is showing you the cycle of going from a trophozoite to a cyst and back to a trophozoite stage. So trophozoites can become reactivated later. And again, so up here we've got a representation now of protozoans that have trophozoite and cyst stages can look very different. This one's just kind of like a wiggly blob here. That's the active feeding stage, damaging its host. And down here it is converted over to a dormant, more of a round cyst stage with a protective wall or shell covering it. And then that can become reactivated later. All right, there are lots of pathogenic protozoans. Now, many of these are way more common in other parts of the world where sanitation is very poor. So a number of these you're not going to encounter all that much in the United States. And so there are pathogenic protozoans that have cilia. There are some that have flagella. There are some that are amoebas. And it looks like, so I downloaded this figure from the publisher's website, and I'm sure up here it's supposed to be listing pathogenic amoebas, and that got deleted off of this particular image. So take a look at this table in your textbook to see it more clearly. But an example of a type of protozoan with cilia is Balantidium coli. And so that lives in the intestinal tract. That name coli suggests that. It causes a disease called balantidiosis. That's a very rough intestinal disease. And that's something we're not all that likely to encounter in the United States. But if you go into other parts of the world, like let's say you went on a mission trip to Africa, you would be much more likely to encounter that. Flagellated protozoans, a really good example, Giardia lamblia. So maybe you've heard of that before. That is a flagellated protozoan that also causes a really nasty diarrhea. Little kids sometimes pass it to each other in daycares if they have it. And so it has this trophozoite stage that lives in the intestinal tract and is feeding, but it goes dormant and forms cysts, and you release those cysts in your feces. So anything that gets contaminated with feces from an infected person can have these cysts, and if you touch something that's been contaminated with feces and put your fingers in your mouth and you swallow those cysts can go on to become active trophozoites in your intestinal tract, and then you have a Giardia infection. I've never had it, but I understand it's not a very pleasant thing to have. So little kids in daycare centers, you guys know they're digging around in their diapers. So some little kid's there and has Giardia, and he gets these cysts on his fingers, and he's playing with toys, dropping the cysts off on the toys. Another kid comes along, touches the toy, fingers into the mouth. Very easy to spread around. Trichomonas vaginalis is a flagellated protozoan that causes the sexually transmitted disease trichomoniasis, or more commonly known as trich. More likely to cause symptoms in females than males. There's the leishmania parasite I was just talking about. The apicomplexan protozoans are not motile, so they don't have any means of swimming around. But some examples: Plasmodium is a genus of protozoans that causes malaria. Toxoplasma gondii causes toxoplasmosis. Cryptosporidium causes cryptosporidiosis. That's a protozoan that every once in a while contaminates public water supplies and causes outbreaks in the United States. Cyclospora, there was an outbreak of Cyclospora protozoans on spinach not too long ago, and it caused, and in several states, people got Cyclospora from eating prepackaged spinach. All right, a little bit more about Trichomonas vaginalis, because this is something that's fairly common, and you'll likely encounter patients that have this, and you've probably heard of the sexually transmitted disease trick before. So it's actually caused by a protozoan, and these are some examples of what it looks like under the microscope, a light microscope in the laboratory, and these have been dyed. They're not naturally purple like this. But the darker spots are nuclei, and then these little hair-like features that kind of look like whiskers, those are flagella, so it has more than one of them. And why do you have this one? Those aren't eyes, those are nuclei. So that's a individual where the nucleus has divided into two, so you've got two copies of the DNA, and so that cell's probably going to be dividing pretty soon and generating two Trichomonas protozoans. All right, so this infects the vagina and the vulva, the external female anatomy, and then in males, the urethra and the prostate. But a lot of times, males don't know that they have this, but they transmit it to their female sexual partners, and then the female can develop vaginal inflammation or vaginitis. This is the most common protozoan pathogen in industrialized nations like the United States. Here's another one I want you guys to have heard of, and this is called Trypanosoma cruzi, or cruzi. And back over here, when we were taking a look at this picture, and I called these trypanosomes are, again, they look like seahorses, but they're just oddly shaped single cells. This organism causes African sleeping sickness. Trypanosoma cruzi, or cruzi, so all these are red blood cells on that picture, and they're in purple, that kind of curved C-shaped cell. Again, looks like a shrimp or a seahorse. That's a protozoan. There's its flagellum, so it is motile. That darker spot there, not an eye, that's in the nucleus where the DNA is located. Well, now that I'm looking at it, this is probably the nucleus over here. That might just be a dye spot or something that's located there. Okay, so what does this cause? This causes a disease known as Chagas's disease, which is endemic in Central and South America. That word endemic lets us know that there are constantly infections of people with this organism. So it's always present at some level. There's always a certain number of people in the population that have that disease at any given time. And as of right now, this is not a huge problem in the United States, but we've had a lot of people migrating into the United States from Central and South America. So this is present in Mexico. And so you might have patients who come into the United States who have Chagas's disease. Because once you've got it, if it's not treated, it can live in the body for a very long period of time. These little creatures can form clusters in your heart muscle tissue if they migrate to the heart. And over time, they can actually weaken the heart and cause congestive heart failure, where your heart's just not able to pump the blood as forcefully any longer. All right, so what's this a picture of? This is a bug called the kissing bug. That's the common name for it. And all right, so this insect is another host for Trypanosoma cruzi, or cruzi. So this organism can live in the kissing bug as a host. And what these bugs do is they like to bite people around the soft tissues around the eyes and around the lips, and they inject these trypanosomes into the tissues, and then it starts multiplying there. Immune system reacts, you get inflammation, and so you can wind up, if the bug bits you around the eyes, you can have a lot of inflammation around the eyes, or it's called a kissing bug because it likes to bite people, soft tissues around the lips, so you can have a lesion around the lips. And like I was saying, your immune system has a hard time getting rid of this. So once you've got it, if you don't get treated for it over time, these little creatures can migrate to your heart and cause congestive heart failure. All right, so this is another protozoan that you guys should be aware of. We don't hear a lot about Chagas disease in the United States yet, but during your careers, this is probably going to become an increasing problem. And another reason is these kissing bugs have migrated from Central and South America into the United States, so they're now present in the southern United States. And so if we wind up with some of these kissing bugs in the United States that are hosting Trypanosoma cruzi, we could start having Trypanosoma cruzi infections just naturally occurring here in the United States among the American population. So this is something we're going to have to pay close attention to. I want to point out this web address here. This is on the Centers for Disease Control website. They have a whole web page there devoted to Chagas disease. So those are just a couple of types of protozoans that I do want you guys to have heard of and be familiar with: Giardia and Trichomonas and Trypanosoma cruzi. And again, use your guidelines. There's more detail in the textbook than you need to know about protozoans. We just don't have time to go into all that detail in this course. Use your guidelines as far as what you actually need to know for Chapter 4 testing purposes. All right, and then our next video lecture from Chapter 4 will be about helminths, and those are your parasitic worms.